Recently, I've been posting quite a lot about the benefits of cold exposure for health and performance, simply because there is now a lot of quality peer-reviewed science in controlled studies looking at how cold exposure can influence things like post-training recovery, core metabolism, and other features. The most exciting study to me is the recent one published in Cell Reports Medicine, first author, Dr. Susanna Soberg. This is beautiful work showing that when people do cold exposure for 11 minutes a week, divided up across 2 or 3 sessions, so that means 2 or 3 minutes or 2 to 4 minutes done 2 to 3 or maybe 4 times a week, a couple of major effects emerge. First of all, there is an increase in resting metabolism overall, and that's a significant increase. Second of all, much of that increase is due to increase in brown fat stores or the efficacy of brown fat stores. Brown fat is not the subcutaneous fat that most of us think of when we think of body fat. It is a particular kind of fat that's actually brown under the microscope because it's rich with mitochondria, one of the major energy sources for cells, and it's enriched around the heart, to some extent around the liver, the clavicles, and the upper back. Having brown fat stores that are denser or more efficient is great because it allows you to feel warm at temperatures that make other people feel cold. That actually was demonstrated in this study. And in addition to that, when people who have high density or high efficiency brown fat get into a cold environment that feels cold to them, there's a greater increase in core metabolism. So how can you achieve this? Well, you do this by getting 11 minutes per week minimum of cold exposure, and ideally that's divided up across 2 or 3 sessions. A question I'm getting a lot is how to get that cold exposure. Here's the truth about the studies on cold exposure is that very few look at cold showers. Almost all of them look at cold water immersion, meaning immersion up to the neck with arms and hands under the water. Sometimes with ice in there, sometimes no, it depends on how cold. We'll talk about how cold in a moment. But this is important. It does not matter how you get cold. You can get cold by being outside with a minimum of layers on. Keep that appropriate, of course. You can take a cold shower. You can get into cold water immersed up to the neck. You can get into an ice bath. It does not matter for sake of the cold exposure. The only thing that really matters is that it is uncomfortably cold, but not so cold that it's a danger to your health. And that number will vary, okay? So for instance, there's a beautiful study published in the European Journal of Physiology some years ago showing that there are big, long-lasting increases in dopamine and norepinephrine when people get into cool water of about 60 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 minutes to an hour. 60 degrees isn't that cold, but it's uncomfortable to stay in there for a while, okay? You could do that, or you could use colder exposure for shorter periods of time. So a much colder shower or a 50-degree immersion, etc. It's all about getting uncomfortable and forcing yourself to stay in longer than your impulse tells you would like to stay in. And that's going to differ for different people. Some people can tolerate 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Some people can tolerate 60. Some people cannot. So it's hugely variable. So the point is to get into a situation where you're uncomfortable and you want to get out, but you stay in for 2 or 3 minutes. And obviously make the cold as cold as possible without making it dangerous to you. And that number will vary. And indeed, there is the possibility of, having cardiac effects if you get into very, very cold water suddenly, especially if you're already heated up. Okay, so proceed with caution, but the idea is to get uncomfortably cold for 2 or 3 minutes, spread done repeatedly 2 or 3 times per week. Doesn't matter. It turns out if it's 3 days in a row and then 4 days off, or you do it every other day, it really doesn't matter, which is great. There's a lot of flexibility in the protocol. That leads to these big increases in metabolism. For those of you that are interested in muscle hypertrophy, there is some evidence that cold water immersion after hypertrophy training can blunt some of the effects on hypertrophy. The data aren't super robust, but there are enough data there that if your main concern is hypertrophy and or strength, probably best to wait 2 to 4 hours before doing cold exposure after hypertrophy training. But if your goal is to reduce inflammation and to recover from training so you can train again, well then immediately after exercise is fine. I think the best time to do deliberate cold exposure is first thing in the morning or in the early part of the day. Later in the day, sometimes it can disrupt sleep because of the increase in adrenaline it can produce, but probably best to do it rather than not do it. And there are other tools that you can use to help fall asleep. So hopefully that clarifies a number of things related to deliberate cold exposure. There are, of course, many, many protocols related to deliberate cold exposure. But one question that I get a lot is, should you warm up after deliberate cold exposure? And it really depends on what your goal is with the deliberate cold exposure. If your deliberate cold exposure is being done in order to increase metabolism, then you do not want to get into the heat right afterward unless you're going to get back into cold. In other words, if you want to increase your metabolism, end on cold, because that forces your body to heat up naturally, to use your endogenous, meaning within you, stores of brown fat and other mechanisms to heat up, and that itself causes a further increase in metabolism. Now, I personally like to do the sauna, then cold, and oftentimes I'll end on the sauna because I like that, but I'm not doing it primarily for increases in metabolic function, at least not at this point. So there are a lot of ways to do these sorts of protocols. Please experiment safely, but do experiment. You have to find what works for you. That 11-minute threshold does seem to be a real threshold. And I should mention that this idea of ending on cold, credit goes to Dr. Susanna Soberg for that. I call this the Soberg principle, which is if you're going to use deliberate cold exposure to try and increase metabolism, end on cold and heat up using your natural body mechanisms rather than getting into a hot shower or a sauna. Or if you're like me and you just want to move comfortably into the next part of your day or your evening, end on heat, and then you can transition more easily into the rest of your day or evening. I hope that answers a number of the major questions around deliberate cold exposure. I'll do more about sauna and sauna exposure. I get a lot of questions about that as well. I'll probably do a whole episode of the Huberman Lab podcast on that. Right now, the Huberman Lab podcast episode that's out is with Dr. David Buss from the University of Texas, Austin, talking about mate choice, deception, some of the more complicated, but also some of the more core mechanisms of how humans select and retain mates over time. It was a fascinating opportunity for me to learn from Dr. Buss. He's one of the luminaries in evolutionary psychology, one of the founders of that field. And that episode is out right now. All the episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast can be found by going to hubermanlab.com. Just scroll down. All of the episodes are there. We also have a monthly newsletter, the Neural Network newsletter. All of these things, of course, are zero cost. Everything is timestamped so you can navigate to topics of interest. The newsletter includes a lot of protocols and steps related to sleep, neuroplasticity, where we have one coming out soon. It relates to an entirely different topic. Please put any questions that you have about deliberate cold exposure, sauna, or frankly, any of the other topics that I've been discussing during this post in the comments section below. If you want to suggest guests for future episodes, that's great too. And thank you for your interest in science.